Hi, I'm Alan. I'm the developer behind Lamora, A Journey in Time. I've had a few people ask me recently how I managed to get the island looking so nice using Gaia. So I said I'd put a quick tutorial together. It's going to be very rough and ready, it's going to be very raw on the settings I used to get the look from this to this. Now you can use any asset pack you like to achieve this effect with the look that you want, but I've used Azure Nature here. So let's get into it. Let's take a look. So what we can see here, we've got our scene. Now I've made a basic terrain. I won't go into terrain generation with Gaia. There's plenty on that. But what I found when I was learning how to use Gaia was just some of the basic things were I was expected to know, and I just didn't because I was too new to game development. So I had to learn it. So hopefully this will provide some details. So the general concept behind Gaia and this terrain system we can see over here on the left is once you've set Gaia up, which happens using this manager, this will be something that will pop up when you install Gaia itself. You'll have a Gaia manager and you'll basically start here at the setup. You'll start on the setup and then you work your way through the process doing the setup, setting up URP or whichever render pipeline. Then you'll create your terrains, then you'll add some tools in there which will include the biome. And now it's interesting to know there is a Sinti biome in there, so if you are using Sinti asset packs it's a good starting place. I found that I used it but then ended up removing a lot of it after using it to learn and then starting from scratch. And then we get what we call the runtime, which contains things like the water, the weather and things like that. But again, we're not going to get into that. It's just a general overview of what you'll end up when you go through. So after we've done that, we'll end up with the Gaia stuff in the hierarchy. So we've got the Gaia tools and we'll have whatever our main biome is. So that'll come out maybe as the Sinti biome. And we'll end up with a texture spawner or a tree spawner, detail spawner. Now these are the things that we need to get stuff onto our terrain. They're the rule sets behind it. What rules are going to take place or be used in order to put textures on the terrain or to put trees or put some details on there. Now what we should probably start with is the textures. That's the bit that paints the sand, it paints the grass, paints the bits round here on the cliffs as well. So we'll take a look on the right side here and we can see first of all we've got these different colours. Now what happens is if we enable these and turn on gizmos, don't forget that, then we're going to see where that texture is allowed to spawn. So it's worth noting here that the textures will run from top to bottom. So if we're looking at our textures here, we have dry sand, so it will put dry sand down as a base layer. Then it will overwrite that with grass. Let's turn grass on. So grass will appear in those areas. So we can see that my dry sand will appear around these edges, but then the grass will go over the top. Now I've not got dirt enabled, so I'm not going to check that one out, but now let's have a look at wet sand. So we can see here wet sand for me is going to go just a bit up the shoreline. So the idea is the water's coming in, it's going to make the sand wet, so I wanted a darker sand effect for that. And then we have the rock. So where's the rock going to appear? So again, we can just see it appearing round where we would expect. But again, this is the last layer that gets put on. So it works from top to bottom. So we're going to get dry sand, we're going to get grass, wet sand, and then we'll get rock. And what happens when we spawn our world? It looks how it should. Now, it's worth noting at this point there is a bug sometimes within Gaia. And what will happen is you'll change a texture somehow. Let's say you change this to a different rock texture. And sometimes it will get mixed up. And it will actually paint a sand texture on there or one of the other ones that you've got. I found this often happens when you're copying and pasting these rules that you've got here, these spawn rules. Now there is a very simple, quick, easy fix. And I'll show you how to do that now, because it's quite irritating when it does happen. So what we need to do is if you go to your spawner and click on advanced, and you've got this option here called resource management, and you just click that. and then you've got a button that says remove resources. Now that'll pop up this little thing that I just had docked there, and you want to make sure that says remove resources, and I would suggest just ticking all the options. That's going to clear the terrain completely, and we click start removal and then continue. So that looks like it's all gone and it's fixed. But what we then need to do is, if you go over to your project view and you want to go into the Gaia user data, you want to find the session that you're on and go to terrain layers. Now these are the textures that were used on that terrain, and this is where the actual problem lies. Sometimes these get mixed up. So all you need to do is delete them. Now you can go back and you can spawn world, and everything will be as it was before, and the things will be painted in the right place. It took me about a week of messing around and waiting for updates to try and get around this one, so hopefully it will save you some time if it happens to you as well. As I say, it seems to be mixed. Some people have it, some people don't. Okay, so let's jump into the rules a little bit. Once we've looked at one set of rules, it pretty much applies to all of them. So it'll apply to the, if we learn them on the textures, it will apply to them on the details, and it will apply to them on the trees as well. So let's have a look at this dry sand. So again, let's remind ourselves where the dry sand actually gets affected. Right, so what we have here, a lot of this is self-explanatory. So we can name what our rule is, we can give it the texture, the normal map that we need, but the main thing that we actually look for in these is the mask setting. So this one is quite straightforward. It appears everywhere because there are no mask settings. So let's go to another one, because we can see that the grass, well, that doesn't appear everywhere, does it? That only appears on the land. So let's expand that one. So again, we've got basic information such as the rule name, we've got the texture, the normal map. I've also set a colour tint on this one as well, just to add a bit of vibrancy to the texture that's there. But then this is where the mask setting comes in, and this is where the real power of Gaia comes in for what we're doing. So what I've done is I've told it to only go between a certain distance relative to sea level. Now the sea level is actually set up in Gaia within the biome itself. So this is relative to sea level. So if I was to turn that off, we can see the grass is actually just going to get painted everywhere, because there is no minimum and maximum height that this grass can be placed. So turning that on is really what sets that level. So imagine we've got this much, we're just telling it to appear in this much here. And then the smoothing, that's not really required on a lot of things, but it really does help. If you just noticed, I've just turned it off, where it blends into the sand. So what it's going to do is just going to blend the textures a little bit more, so it's not that flat line from grass to sand. Now that really is quite straightforward. And again, the wet sand one is another height mask, but this time it's using it the other way round. So this one's going below sea level just a little bit to just above sea level. So it's only going to get so far up the shore before it stops applying that texture. And we can see when we turn that on, how we can see the red line on this left here just blends in ever so slightly up the sand, so we've got that wet sand look. Now the rock, again, that's going to be something a little bit different, because we haven't got a height mask on this, because the rocks could be up on top of the terrain. So over here, for instance, they could be, or they could be right down in the water. So what we're using on this one is a slope mask. So as long as the terrain is hitting a certain slope, that's when we want to paint this rock texture on. And we can see here that I've got this set between a 0 and a 23.68 degree slope. That's when that's going to get used. So again, if we turn that on, now if we turn the slope mask off, I keep minimizing, it's just going to appear everywhere. So it's these masks, they're the real important thing when we're setting up our Gaia rules, because they're explaining where things can go, and that's what achieves this terrain detail that we're looking for. So let's just turn all those off, and that's how we get that. Just go down and have a look at that. So this is what I was meaning with the slopes on the rocks. See, this is higher than obviously the sea level, but we still want this effect to appear here. Okay, let's move on to terrain details. So let's have a look at the detail spawner now. Now I know this is called Cinti detail spawner, I just didn't rename it. But again, I've only got 3 spawn rules set up in here, but they've actually got multiple prefabs within them. So let's go for the grass, for instance, because that one's a little bit smaller than some of the others. So we can see here I've got a grass 1 and I've got a grass 2. Now you can add an instance here, and again, a lot of this user interface, it's really intuitive. You add your name on there, you set whether you want it to be a texture, a detail, a terrain tree, or a game object. So we need it to be a game object because I want it to be interactable in the environment. I want LOD to come in on my assets as well. So that's why we're using a game object. So let's open up the grass one here. So again, I've assigned the prefab. We've got different offsets we can use, so whether you want it to appear a certain way above the ground or below the ground, and then you can set offset rotations as well, just to randomize things a little bit. And you've got spawn scales. Again, if you want to have that as a random spawn scale, you can have large bits of grass or smaller bits of grass. Now what's interesting on these ones is you've got, well, I'm just losing it, here we go, probability rates just there. So you've got a probability rate against each of these prefabs within this spawn rule. So let me just show you this. I've got this probability rate set to 93%, and I've got this one set to as close to 7% as Unity will allow it to go. So overall that's 100% being spawned, but I'm wanting most of the grass to be this grass 1, which is why this is only 7%. But we also notice down here there's another probability rate under spawning. So it's worth knowing that that is actually separate. So that probability rate there relates to this rule in comparison for all of these rules put together. So what it's saying, when it comes to laying these details out and running this spawner, that spawner will run 100% of the time. And then within those rules, of that 100% of the time it runs, so each time it runs, 93% of the time it's going to spawn one of these grass objects. The other 7% it's going to spawn the grass 2 object. So I'm guaranteed when it's running the spawner in an area to have a piece of grass 100% of the time. Now this is a little bit different when it comes to some of the other setups that I've got here. For instance, the flowers. So the flowers are 30%. So overall, when Gaia is calculating whether it wants to place something down on the floor, there is a 30% chance that this rule as a whole, my flowers rule, will be run. If it is run, I then have percentages based on that as well. So if we go to flowers, 65% of the time it's going to be this first lot of flowers. 30% of the time, I'm not sure where the other 5% went, 30% of the time it's going to be this second lot of flowers. So that means I'm not always going to get flowers everywhere all over the terrain. There's only a 30% chance overall, remember, because we've got this probability rate here set to 30%. So of that 30%, it will either be one of the pink flowers or one of the blue flowers, based on the inner percentages within there. I hope that makes sense. Once you start playing around with it, it really does kick in and it's understandable. Now there's something else interesting on these that I've used quite a lot, and that's min and max instances. Now when I was generating the terrain, I thought, well, you're not just going to have one flower just sprouting up random places throughout the map. If you have one flower, the chances are you're going to have quite a few flowers in a bunch, and this is where the min and max instances come in. So a random number between 15 and 20, a random amount of instances are going to be spawned when it actually spawns this. And again, we've got our rotation and offsets that we can adjust. So this is quite important. The spawn offset X and spawn offset Z, when you're using min and max instances, you don't want them all on top of each other. So if you were to set each of these to 0, you would end up between 15 and 20 prefabs just sat on top of each other, and it would look quite messy. But because of this random spawn offset that we've got between -3 and 0 on the X and -3 and 3 on the Z, this means that the prefabs are actually spread out in an area of 3 this way, 3 that way, 3 that way, and 3 that way. So you end up with a nice patch of flowers, and that really does make the scene come to life. It looks like it looks more natural because of the way the flowers are. And again, if we go to the flowers blue, because they're spawning less, we've only got a 30% chance of having these blue flowers when this spawner kicks in. We have between 20 and 30 of these. And again, because I've got so many, I've actually expanded the spawn offset to -5 to 5 on the X and -5 to 5 on the Z. So it gives it a bigger area that bunch of flowers can actually spawn in. And again, that I was tweaking these values and playing around with them, and these just seem to fit my scene best. But as long as you know how it works, then you can play with it and make it work. Now let's take a look at the other rule that I've got in place here for other objects. I've called this. So this one's probably the busiest one I've got. I'm just going to minimize them all. So when we looked at our scene, we've got bushes of different kinds. We've got some mossy stones on the floor, and we've got plain stones on there as well. And this is what's controlling this. So again, I run this rule 100% of the time. You'll notice here, probability rate 100%. So in an area, there is always going to be something that gets spawned. So again, like our flowers had a probability rate of 30%. So it's not always going to spawn the flowers. It will always do something within one of these. So let's break these down a little bit. So stones 1. What's our probability rate for this one? Very small. There's not a high chance that it's going to spawn one of these stones. But again, we've got between 1 and 5 stones, and we've got our offset set so it spawns it in a range. Let's minimize that one. The stone with the moss on, again, that's at 3% as well. And we've got between 1 and 10 of those, again, in a 3 that way, 3 that way range. Then we'll have a look at our bushes. So this one actually, this rule is set to run 100% of the time, as we see here. But these don't actually take up 100%. So there's only something like a 5% chance that this will actually spawn an object. So I could have, when setting this up, set this probability rate down here on the right, down here, to 5. And then just split the other values up accordingly to make up 100% within that. But I guess when I was playing around with this one, I just chose not to. So again, we're not going to get a bush very often at all, because we don't want bushes everywhere. And when we do, we want between 1 and 5 in a 1-to-1 area on the X and the Z. Now that could probably do with being adjusted a little bit just to spread them out, but it seems to be working fine at the moment. So they're the prefabs that we have spawning on this set of rules here. Now it's also worth noting that we do have masks again for the detail spawners. So let's go back to the grass and we'll look at the masks now of what they need. So I have a terrain texture mask. Now we remember when we looked at our texture spawner, we can see where the grass is. So let's turn that back on. So this is the grass texture. So what I've actually told Gaia to do, is only spawn this grass prefab on the grass texture. And I've also adjusted the height mask a little bit so that it will only spawn in certain areas. So let me just turn that off, and we'll turn the detail color on for this one. So there we go. So you can actually see on here, if I turn this height mask off, it will appear everywhere that grass texture is. But I didn't want that, because I didn't want the grass just ending up right on the edge on where the beach was. So I added this height mask in as well, which then causes it just to come a bit further up. So it will go to the main body of the island, but not down right to the shoreline. So that one's straightforward. We've only got a terrain texture there, and we've got a height mask. So let's take a look now at the flowers. So the flowers again, I only want the flowers to appear on the grassland. Let's just change that colour up a little bit so that we can see it a bit better. So I only want the flowers to appear on the grassland area. So we've set a terrain texture mask again, and we've set it to grass, And again, I've set a height rule because I don't want flowers spawning down right on the edge of where the grass will be. So I've just pushed all that up using a height mask. Let's take a look at the other objects. So this one, it seems, again, is based on that grass, and it's also based on that height mask. I think I must have just copied and pasted these ones because it worked really well. Now, something that I haven't done yet that I will be doing is actually flipping it around a little bit so I can get some other types of details, maybe some palm trees or some brown grasses that can actually go along the beach instead to look like they're sort of withering a little bit of bracken going along. So what I'll do is I'll invert the height mask at that point so that it appears further down, and I'll tell it to maybe appear only on the sand. But again, that's the power that we've got with these masks, so that we can really isolate where we want things to appear. So I think that covers the terrain details quite well. So let's just spawn those in now as well. Let me just turn. And we'll see how our scene looks now that we've got these textures in and we've got these terrain details in. So there we go. That's just finished. That took a moment to do, as it does. But now we can see. Now, just for anybody that's unaware, the reason that you can't see it here is all my textures, or my details, sorry, the assets have LOD on them, so you can't see them when you're zoomed this far out. But when you're going up closer, then you can see them all. So that is already, just adding those terrain details on and those terrain textures, that's already transformed this scene. And let's just have a look at these again now that we've got them here, because we can see how these rules are actually working a little bit better when we can review them side by side with the details that have come up. So we're looking at the grass here, and let's look again at the grass one. So we know that this spawner is running 100% of the time, and 93% of that time will be this grass here. It's this stuff here, but 7% will be this lighter coloured, and you can really see the difference that makes. It just adds a bit more character, doesn't it? Now let's find a patch of flowers and we'll have a look at that rule. We can see, again, you can see the rocks that have been randomly placed as well. Now remember, there's only a 30% chance of the flowers spawning, which is why they're not all over the place. But when they do appear, look, we get a nice spread of them and it looks quite pretty. So again, let's review that flower rule. So we know that the probability of the flowers actually spawning, or trying to spawn in the first place, is only 30%. And what's it going to spawn? Well, it's either going to spawn the flowers blue, or it's going to spawn the flowers which are actually pink in this case. So we've got a 65% chance that the pink ones will spawn, or a 30% chance that the blue ones will spawn. And we'll see that as we go around actually. If we saw more flowers, you've got your pinks, got your blues, so it turns out the blues are actually coming out better on this one. But again, you see the nice spread that we set up earlier. It spreads it out really nicely. But again, this is about looking at your terrain and playing with these values, but it's these values that make the big difference. This is what we're looking for, to get this nice natural look. Don't just clump everything all in one go or make it too uniform. Sometimes we can make things too random, like just put flowers in all random places. Flowers need to be grouped together because that's how they would naturally appear. So let's take a look at the tree spawner now. Okay, so here we have the tree spawner. Now I've only got a couple of these set up, but I use a few different settings on this one. So let's look at our fir tree to start with. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll actually spawn the trees in first this time, and we can look at the rules side by side along with the trees that are there. So I'm just going to click spawn world. So we can see here that we've got some fir trees, and then we'll go and find some birches, sorry. And we've got some birch trees. And again, I really am happy with the placement of these trees. I think it's coming out quite well. And in fact, I'm so happy with this that I don't mind just clearing it all each time and regenerating it, because it always seems to come up with something nice. And that's actually how this scene over here, when I created it put some trees around here, and it did a really nice job. So I actually moved those out into static objects so I could keep those in those positions. So let's have a look at these trees. So we've got a bunch of firs here. So we'll look at the prefabs. sorry, we'll start with the firs. Here we go. So fir 1. So what we're actually doing here, we're spawning between 5 and 10 of these firs. But something that we've not done with the details yet is we've actually set the spawn scale to random. So we can see here we've got different size trees. So we've got this smaller one, we've got this bigger one here as well. So let's just go back to our tree spawner. And that's where this bottom section comes in, the scale. Spawn scale, I've set this to random. And I've set it between a 0.5 and a 2. And the rest of it we've seen with the details. We've got a probability rate of 20% that this will run. So basically all I've done is I've set the overall probability. So when Gaia scans this particular area here, what percent chance is there that it's going to look at the tree spawner? Well, there's a 30% chance that it will look at the tree spawner. Then when it's in there, what percent chance is it that it's going to be a fir 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Well, I've just set all of these to 20%. So it's a uniform split between the different types of trees that I've set up there. Now there really isn't much difference between the trees now and the detail spawner that we set up earlier and looked at the bushes and so on. All I've done is set the spawn offsets, and I've set the amount of instances that I want to do. And that's exactly the same that I've done for the birch ones as well. So let's have a look at the birch. So we've got 5 different trees that I've set up. Again, this time there's only a 15% chance that the birch trees. So when Gaia's calculating this particular area here, there's a 15% chance this spawner will kick in. And of that 15%, then when it's in, it's a 20% chance for tree 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And again, that's how that works. And we've got our masks in. And they're the same masks as we had for the details. We've got our terrain. We only want the trees to appear on the grass. And then we've got the height mask as well. So we only want them to appear just above. We don't want them coming down on the grass. I'm going to have different types of trees for that. So that's just sort of a rough overview of how I've managed to achieve what I've achieved and this look and feel. And it does really look beautiful. I'm really happy with how it's come out. But just a few things to remember is that sometimes less random is better. Try and think about it. It's all good procedurally generating our content, but we still need to put thought into how it's actually going to look and where we want things to appear. Because once we've taken the time to set these rules up and make sure that trees only appear on this cliff or the palm trees only appear on the beach, then it means that we can generate our terrain, our details and our textures, and we just know that it's going to take place and it's going to happen the way we want it to happen, and it's going to look beautiful every time. So that's all from me. I'll see you next time.